Well, hey there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night. Thank you for joining me here over at HowlingMines. My name is Scott, HowlingMines. I have been a card game content creator for a solid while now, and I'm lucky to finally have some kind of result worth talking about in the world of Flesh and Blood. So if you're joining me, you might have seen the post that's doing the rounds on social media. I was lucky enough this weekend to be at Pro Tour Lille, and had a fantastic time. Got to hang out with a lot of my very, very close friends, play a card game that I'm super passionate about, and do really well in the calling in Lille, finishing in 13th place with a deck that a few people were kind of surprised to see. Didn't think it was necessarily viable in this current format while Prism was still legal. And that, of course, was Iyslander Stormbind. I'm here today to kind of walk you through this deck, explain my deck list, some of my choices for the event, kind of break down the matches I played, and give you some basic tips and tricks on play patterns with the deck, some sideboarding notes, just anything I can do really to kind of help people that are interested in taking this archetype moving forward and working on it heading into national season. I think Iyslander is really powerful. I think a lot of people got a bit tied up in the play patterns. The deck is kind of confusing at points, can let you do some very strange things with some strange rules interactions. And of course, has horrible matchups into Illusionist, which can be quite off-putting for people that are looking for consistency when it comes to a big event. But I think there's a lot of ground here, and I think Iyslander stands to benefit the most from a deck like Prism and becoming Living Legend. And if you're not respecting it already, or maybe haven't explored it already, it is definitely a deck I recommend trying out. I will start by prefacing this. Of course, that my limited experience has very much been in playtesting for the calling in Lille. So I don't have hundreds of games under my belt with this Iyslander list. I just have a variety of matchups from the event, and of course my playtesting for the event. So my opinions are by no means steadfast. And if you do disagree with anything I have to say about the deck, or you test it yourself and you find something that maybe changes the way that things play out, or a way to improve a certain matchup, please let me know either in the comments section below, or reach out to me on your social platform of choice. I am HowlingMines everywhere, and if you want to talk about Flesh and Blood or Iyslander, I would love to do so with you, so please let me know what you think. With that note, I'm going to take a list now and pop it up on screen for you in picture form. If you are looking for just the deck list and you want to grab it as an exportable form in text that you can play on TTS or Fab Online, it's in the description box below. Go and grab it down there and you can export it. Sideboard should be ready to go on there, and if you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, here we go. There is my Iyslander list in full that I took 13th place with at the calling in Lille. So for the record, I went 10-3 over the course of the event to finish in 13th, and I started the event 6-0. I was really happy with how things started. Unfortunately for me, I finished day 1 6-2 as I bumped into 2 copies of Prism at the end of the first day of competition, and I did one more loss over the course of the event, which was to a Dash player over the course of day 2 in a match where I think if I had maybe played a little different or a little tighter, I could have come out on top, and unfortunately my mistakes or maybe missed choices kind of caught up with me in that matchup, because I do think it is quite good. Now, if you're looking at this photo for the first time, what I want you to know is that everything to the right of the Heart of Fiendel is the sideboard cards in question. So everything you see before that is the deck's core. There are 17 cards coming in every matchup that aren't equipment. So you're going to be looking for 17 cards on that right-hand side for each matchup that you want to play to add to the rest of this core. The core does not change. Everything you see there is cards you should, in my opinion, be playing in every matchup. One of the questions I've got the most on social media is the Heart of Fiendel necessary? Unfortunately, I think so. This is possibly the best Heart of Fiendel deck ever. Starting on 36 life means the card is never blank for you. And to put it bluntly, I gained 22 life with Heart of Fiendel over 13 rounds in the calling, and it probably won me many games just by incidentally gaining me life alongside cards like Oasis Respite. I do think it's a required card, sadly, if you're playing the deck at the most competitive of levels, but if you are playing it at your local armories or with friends, there's a chance you can get away with not running it. So we're going to walk through this deck list real quick before I start breaking down sideboard choices in case you aren't familiar with these cards, and just kind of explain some of the ratios to you. So you'll see that we have 13 reds that start in the core. This is an important number because we have another 9 reds in the sideboard that come in certain matchups. Something you want to keep in mind is you really do not want to ever go below 41 blues in every matchup that you're playing with Iyslander. It's important to keep your hands to a minimum of 3 blues, ideally. No more than 2 reds if you have to, because drawing 3 red and 4 red hands gets you in a lot of trouble with the normal play patterns with this deck. I'm reliably informed the number for that is 42, if you want a 5% chance of drawing a 3 red hand over the course of the game. I haven't done the math myself, that's what I've been told, so if that's incorrect I apologise, but that's the operation I was operating under. So there are matchups where you will play 41 blues just because we're playing a suite of defense reactions that kind of make that okay, in my opinion, but you can't afford to go below 41. Ideally, in most matchups, you want at least 42. So your red damage spells, the important thing about the spells we've chosen here, they are the best on-rate cards that always fuse. It's important that your red damage effects in this Iyslander effect have the ability to fuse. So in case, Freezing Point, Aether Ice Vein, all will trigger Insidious Chill, will all trigger Amulet of Ice. There are many matchups where this is exceptionally important, and you'll be taking damage in early turns to set up chills, set up amulets, because once you've done so, these red damage effects force your opponent to either take a chunk of Arcane so they can afford to play through Frostbites and Disruption and still have a turn, or they're going to kind of like have to prevent Arcane and not have a turn and not play through the Frostbites in any way if they want to save their life total. So you need these effects to do this. Red Ice Vein is your best attack in nearly every matchup. You'll find it's pairing very well with these chill effects, these amulet effects, to just really test your opponent's hand and let them keep as few cards as possible. Freezing Point tends to be your preferred finisher of choice. A lot of times in matchups where you're having to set up Frost Hexes, which are mostly the Guardian matchups, but you will find occasionally you play a Frost Hex against some other people if the life totals are high enough. You want to be able to Freezing Point alongside a Arctic Incarceration from your arsenal. If you've preemptively been able to play some Eisenhower Weather Vanes in the Guardian matchups, so you can tag all those Frostbites as well. And just basically play it off your Storm Striders at instant speed once those cards are set up to do 8, 9, sometimes 10 arcane damage as a burst turn off of a red from your Storm Striders. So it's going to be the one you play to and pitch early often because you want to find it again late. In case, this card really impressed me. When I was looking to build this list, I just wanted another red attack that was able to be fused. And a few people have suggested Icebind, but I do think the text on In Case is super relevant. You want to freeze equipment all the time. Freezing Findle's Spring Tunic so that your opponent can't pay for Coronet Peak or pay for anything else they want to use that resource for over the course of turns. Comes up all the time, literally all the time. Freezing other things like Iron Weave, Vexing Quillhand, sometimes Achilles Accelerator, even Tectonic Plating. Turning these cards off is a relevant effect, and is an effect that your opponents will have to respect a lot of the time. Even the olden players who are playing things like Heart of Ice that are really impactful against you, that they want to be activating every turn, turning it off for a turn so that you can keep your defense reactions costing 0. Really big deal, kind of forces the issue in your favour. And it's also just a cheap card that you can occasionally keep a 1-card hand if you need to block quite aggressively and still do something proactive. And it makes for some really interesting Storm Strider decisions as well. You can find sometimes that if you have a Tunic resource available and your Storm Strider is available, that your opponent will extend into you if you only have 1 card left in hand, thinking that there is no way they can be killed at instant speed. And you can definitely remove a Tunic resource, pop Storm Striders, and just play a Freezing Point, a In Case for 3, and kill people out of nowhere sometimes. So definitely worth keeping in mind. Oasis Respite. This card was a mistake. I've gone on the record as saying this a few times. It's just not a card that should exist. You should play in every matchup as far as I'm concerned. Leveraging the life gain is super easy for this deck because you should normally be behind on life over the course of most games. You, of course, start lower than your opponent. But this is just able to prevent all the damage from Rosetta Thorn, prevent damage strategically from cards with crush triggers against Guardians. It is just the best defense reaction in the game right now because it's basically a 1-cost block 5, and sometimes it's just a 1-cost block 4 that gains you a life for a later attack as well. It's just everything you want from a defensive red, and I would never play less than 3. I think the card is one of the best cards in the game right now, in my personal opinion. The one Nourishing Emptiness. A few people think this card is a trap. I understand the concern, because if you're playing Iyslander, you believe it's because people aren't necessarily respecting the ability of arcane damage right now. Maybe they're not bringing quite enough arcane barrier. So they're playing a chunk of Null Rune would kind of defeat the point of that. And if they're not playing a chunk of Null Rune, which is beneficial for you, they're going to have armor that can accidentally block this Nourishing Emptiness. And over the course of the event, I did definitely get this Emptiness blocked a few times in spots where I would really rather it didn't. From cards like Crown of Seeds, again, Bravo players that just have to wear Tectonic Plating, Oldhim, defense reactions. There's a few ways of doing it in those kind of matchups, but the upside on this card is just far too high. There are turns where being able to just keep a 3-card hand when your opponent has an off turn, play an Emptiness, arsenal a card, draw 5 is just like a game-winning line of play. The upside is high enough that it is worth accepting. Sometimes your opponent will turn over an armor sweep where this doesn't do enough. Because even in those worlds, the card still blocks 3, which makes it fine for most of your turns where you're preferring to keep 2 blues for Coronet and Arsenal instead. And when that's not the case, sometimes it's just a 6-power attack, which comes up against like Prism and Dromai. I very much wanted the 4th popper in the list somewhere, and playing an Emptiness main deck made that super easy. So, worth playing in my opinion. Big fan. So, blues. Lots of blues in the core of this deck. Many, many blues. So you'll see the first row of cards that we have here is your damage effects. Most of these, admittedly, don't go in your arsenal as often as you would think. There are a few matchups like Viscerai, sometimes certain versions of Briar, where you really want to be racing your opponent. The thought process you should have in these spots is not like a traditional race, but you want to block strategically and play a damage effect from your arsenal that can be mildly disruptive if it's an ice card, and then activate your Waning Moon in addition to that. This plan is even better against Viscerai because you can utilize Alluvian Constellus to pay for your weapon, so you can block with 3 cards sometimes and still play a card from your arsenal, activate your weapon, arsenal another card. You want to keep your life total and your opponent's life total as close as you possibly can in these matchups, because eventually you'll get to the point where both of you are somewhere between 5 and 8 life, and they should extend to try and kill you on that final turn, and you should be able to pop Stormstriders to be able to kill them in response to them trying to kill you with that final hand with a red. And that tends to be the play pattern you find an awful lot in these Runeblade matchups. You can pretend to be Oldhim for a little while. You can be super defensive, chipping in damage when you can, using Node against Briar or using Constellus against Viscerai, and kind of just buying your time to set up these situations where you can take 4 damage but deal 6. You can take 3 damage but deal 7. Most of the time you're going to be dealing 5 to 6 in exchange in your opponent's turn while blocking and trying to keep a card to arsenal. Sometimes you will actually prevent more damage from your opponent by taking a hit during their turn and using Coronet Peak on the following turn to win the next turn cycle, which is definitely a play pattern you want to keep in mind. The important thing about all these damage effects is they all block 3. One of the big keys to Iyslander, in my opinion, is that playing cards that block 3 is like the best thing you can do. The less 2 blocks you have to play, the more you will enact the game plan you want of being able to block with 2 cards, coronet your opponent, arsenal a card. Or block with 2 cards, activate weapon, arsenal a card. These are the play patterns you're looking to achieve as consistently and as often as you possibly can. And if your cards block 3, or your defense reactions block 4, you're going to be able to more consistently keep the cards you actually want in your arsenal, pitch the things you actually want to coronet and weapon to pitch stack the bottom of your deck for later turns, and still, defend appropriately and block as much damage as you possibly can. So these all having 3 toughness, super relevant. If you're not sure about the selection on these, I think most of them are fairly intuitive. Blue Ice Vein is just the best damage spell in my opinion. It costing 3, it triggers Insidious Chill, triggers Amulet, which is fantastic. It's one you're pretty happy to arsenal a lot of spots to disrupt your opponent in their turn. Blue Ice Vein triggering Chill in your opponent's turn is really powerful and something you should definitely respect. Ice Bolt is the weakest of the bunch here. A 2 cost card from your arsenal is normally pretty bad. You really do want to be able to play 1 cost and 0 cost cards from your arsenal so you can weapon next to them without having to spend an extra card. You want a blue to pay for the card from the arsenal and your weapon in a lot of spots, which makes Ice Bolt the worst of these damage effects. It's still fine, it's reasonable on rate. Most of the time you will block with it quite aggressively. It just means you have extra damage in your arsenal, and on your Tunic turns it can still pair very well with your weapon to deal 6 from arsenal and weapon alone, which is of course a good tempo swing in your favour. Blue Aether Hail, just the best damage spell in my opinion. Blocks 3, costs 1, means it plays very well with your weapon. Makes a Frostbite, like all of these ice cards here do. This selection of 9 Ice Bolts, High Ills, and Frostings, which again, damage spells are ice cards, just superior for being able to fuse and play out of your arsenal to make Frostbites. Frosting, very much the same thing. You'd be surprised how often the 1 damage matters, but this costing 0 means that it plays super well on turns where you want to weapon and pay for Oasis Respite off of a blue, and still be able to play a card from your arsenal to turn the weapon on. It's also just, again, an ice card, blue, that blocks 3, which means it can only ever be so bad in a deck like this. Ice Eternal. This is a card that causes a lot of contention between Iyslander players. You will not be casting Ice Eternal very often, but the times where you do cast it, it is often going to be the card that wins you the game. In any matchup where you're trying to establish this combo kill element, mostly Bravo and Oldhim, but there are a few times where you find yourself falling into this game plan against anyone else, like the Mirror Match, or slower Viscerize sometimes, who are more dedicated to playing Read the Runes, and trying to just build up a 1-turn Arcane Burst against you, which is something that I have encountered in my travels. You will want to Ice Eternal those cards, but for the most part, this is too expensive to play from your arsenal and get the effect you want. A lot of the time, paying 6 resources into this for 3 Arcane and 3 damage is not going to turn your opponent's turn off, and you leave yourself without any cards to block with, or arsenal, or do anything with on the following turn. That being said, it's super important. It's a card you have to play. It enables these OTK kills in the Guardian matchups with your Frost Hexes, which we'll get into a little bit more later on. It blocks 3. It's blue. Means it can only ever be so bad. You can do a little trick that I don't see enough people doing with Ice Eternal. It does a really bad in-case impression sometimes. There are definitely times where it's correct to play Ice Eternal and fuse it 4-0. Or play it from your arsenal 4-0. Because you want to turn on your weapon, or because you want to trigger Insidious Chill, trigger Amulet for no resources. And this card can do that for you because it does have a fuse effect on it, regardless of whether or not it is doing damage. So you'll find that comes up quite a bit, honestly, with Insidious Chills and stuff when you want to trigger those cards. And this lets you do that as cheap as you possibly can. It's a super flexible card. For the most part, in non-Guardian matchups, you want to avoid arsenaling this. You will block with it pretty happily, or you can pitch it early if you expect to get to some kind of late game. Okay, so the next column you see along, this is what I will call the disruption side of the cards that start in your core. Heart kind of doesn't belong here. It just didn't really fit anywhere else. We've kind of talked about why it's so good already, so we won't worry about that too much. Insidious Chill. This card is so powerful. You'll find this is the card alongside Aether Ice Vein that in a lot of matchups you should be willing to take damage to play. Iyslander cannot afford to just take damage to play a mediocre turn. You don't want to take hits from your opponent to play a Encase and Arsenal card when you could block with the Encase, save 3 life and Arsenal instead. Because to set up your power plays, you have to take damage because your cards are so expensive and hard to get into play in a lot of matchups. You want Chill in the aggro matchups. It, alongside Aether Ice Vein, is going to be what eventually buys you the window you need to get tempo of the game. You want to fuse an Ice Vein with Chill or multiple Chills in play and strip your opponent's hand. If you can do that, you're going to buy yourself a window where you have 5 cards and you should be able to now control the narrative of the game going forward. But you have to be willing to take a hit to get these things on the table. So don't leak damage early. Make sure you're setting these up and taking damage to do so in spots where your opponent lets you make that choice. Frost Hex. This is not your win condition in a lot of matchups. It is very much there as a blue ice block 3 most of the time. And that makes it good enough for every matchup alone. The only times you're going to play a Frost Hex are in the matchups where you want to try and OTK your opponent, Guardian matchups, or if you win the die roll and have nothing to do with your opening hand, or occasionally turns 2 to 3 when your opponent is having a bad turn and they give you breathing room and life totals are still very, very high. Don't Arsenal Frost Hex in non-Guardian matchups. You will never want to pay 3 to get it out. Like, paying 3 for a Frostbite instant speed just isn't good enough. So, don't fall into that trap. It is mostly a Blue Eyes block 3 that enables you to win the Guardian matchup. That is what it is in the deck for. Channel Lake Frigid, this kind of goes without saying, this card is ridiculous. It has been a mainstay of constructed play ever since it was made. It is fantastic into the aggro matchups, and it is once again a Blue Ice block 3 in every other matchup. Always play it. Cold Snap. Wow. Cold Snap is a card that a lot of people slept on early in Iyslander deck building, and it is just probably the best block 2 you can play. You'll notice that we're, again, really playing very, very few block 2s in the core because we don't want that. We want to be able to block 3 as often as we can. Insidious Chill and Cold Snap are the 2 that are good enough to always make the cut. Now, why is that? Sometimes your opponent will try and set up big turns, arsenaling cards that matter. Sometimes Guardians Heave, or maybe Runeblades want to put Revel in Runeblood or similar effects into their arsenal to try and set up for big turns later. So freezing it, or forcing your opponent to choose between paying for something else and freezing it, is a relevant effect, but that is not why this card is so good. Cold Snap alone lets you keep a 4-card hand and pay for a weapon all by itself, because you are pitching a blue to play it. It makes a Frostbite. The 2 resources you pitch, pay for weapon. You still have 4 cards because you drew a card from Cold Snap. This basically makes this card like Crown of Seeds adjacent. It's going to let you have essentially 5 to 6 card hands sometimes because it drew you an extra card. And you will often play it off of your Tunic resource in matchups where you're playing Tunic and just have a 5-card hand and activate your weapon for free. So your opponent has already taken 3 Arcane, had their arsenal frozen, and you have 5 cards in your hand, which is just absurd. Cold Snap is one of your favourite cards to arsenal early and aggressively if you're looking to stall the game out and move back to your late game plans. It's just incredible. I would never play less than 3. Amulet of Ice. Okay, so this is a weird one, I think, for a lot of folks. We only played 2 Amulet of Ice. I was on 3 actually right up until the day before the tournament when I had to find space for some other cards, which we can talk about in a bit. But the sad truth is, Amulet is a necessary evil because you want more of the Insidious Chill style effects for when you're setting up combo kill turns against Guardians. And it's also really good to play as a 0 out of the arsenal when you're trying to make a Frostbite activate your weapon. And plays very well as a one-time burst alongside an Insidious Chill. Again, gaining tempo from fusing an Ice Vein, triggering Chill, popping an Amulet, buys you a lot of time and often just wins you the turn cycle immediately, which means these are like, think of them as one-time Insidious Chills. You don't want to be taking damage to set them up. You want to be usually keeping it as one of the 2 cards you keep in your hand to Arsenal or pitch to Coronet. And you can like pitch to Coronet, Arsenal the Amulet, and then during their turn, play the Amulet out, activate your weapon if you have the ability to, and then hopefully be able to fuse an Ice Vein to trigger a Chill and the Amulet to just buy you a whole turn cycle. Sadly, it doesn't block, and that's a really big downgrade on a card you want to play in the core of this deck, because your card's blocking is just so important. So I don't think you ever want the 3rd. I think the Heart of Fiendel is just much better in that role because it's gaining you life to replace the fact it doesn't block. If you don't have a Heart, though, I imagine the third amulet is probably where I would start in terms of cards to play instead. It is really good in this shell, plays very well with the rest of what you're doing, is very synergistic, but I think it's going to be worse than the heart basically always. So equipment suite that we always start in most matchups. We have our Waning Moon. It's the only weapon you play. Waning Moon is insane. The entire deck is built around activating it efficiently and often. Fiendel Spring Tunic, obviously just a great generic chess piece everyone is playing in so many decks, but it really shines in a deck like Iyslander. It can often pay for your Ironhide Gauntlets or your Storm Striders or a Cold Snap to allow you extra card flexibility on turns where you really need to be able to bend to your opponent's moves. It's just great at paying for Oasis Respite and similar cards as well. You just have a lot of one-cost cards that really benefit from having Tunic in the deck. In a similar vein, you have that play pattern of Ice Bolt and the resource left over, and your Tunic to activate a weapon during your opponent's turn that comes up quite often, which is kind of like the whole brute attack into pummel line that the Manzant style Olivia decks are quite used to. You basically do that in your opponent's turn sometimes with your Tunic resource. Don't be afraid to hold your Tunic resource. It's really valuable. You don't need to use it as aggressively as you can to get it ticking back up again. Because it pays for so many things, you can often want it there for when it's time to Storm Striders, or want it there in case you draw an Oasis Respite, or something similar to this. So having your Tunic just sitting on 3 is fine. You shouldn't ever worry about that, I don't think. Coronet Peak. This card is absurd. And if you don't own one, and you want to play this deck, go get them while they're cheap. Because some of the legendaries for this deck that aren't Storm Striders are currently very, very cheap, and I don't think they're going to stay that way for very long. Coronet Peak single-handedly carries you in so many matchups. If you're able to keep a second card, you deny your opponent a card during their turn, which means their turns can not be as explosive as you're worried about them being. In a matchup like Bravo, for example, where the only thing that matters is dominated attacks that you can't block properly, or attacks being pummeled because they've used their whole hand to break through Frostbites and then can play a 2-cost pummel on top and make you discard a card you didn't want to discard. Coronet Peak just decreases the odds of that happening to you so significantly because you're earning a card from their hand every single time. I cannot state its praises high enough. It is just one of the best headpieces you could possibly ask for in this deck. It's built to use it optimally, and it blocks too. And you will find yourself happy to block with it when you get into a lot of the 18 to 16 life ranges against matchups where you're trying to stay on even life totals. Or you'll find it in a lot of spots where you need to stop important hit triggers from your opponent, maybe a Snatch, maybe a Movrian Skies, or on turns where you want to be able to keep a hand to set up Insidious Chill, or set up an Aether Ice Vein or something similar. Coronet's going to help buy you a lot of time in those spots if you're willing to give it up, but the longer you can keep it around in a lot of cases, the better. Storm Striders. It's hard to really say anything that hasn't been said about this card already. It is going to be your endgame in a lot of matchups, even when you aren't combo killing and going for a big endgame freezing point alongside Frost Hexes. Playing the game so that your life totals remain close and then bursting your opponent at instant speed with Storm Striders is one of the most powerful things that Iyslander can do, in my opinion. It's just something that no other class has access to. You can threaten Aether Ice Vein on your turn, push your opponent down to 5 or 6 life, and then with a blue card in your arsenal and a Storm Striders, you can push upwards of 12, 13 damage, even when they aren't on the Frost Hex plan. You can quite often be Blue Arctic Incarceration or even just an Ice Bolt or something from the arsenal, activate weapon, Storm Striders a freezing point, Storm Striders an Aether Ice Vein, and of course the hit triggers from Aether Ice Vein and even things like Crippling Chill are going to make it harder for your opponent to be able to pay Arcane on those turns because they extended cards already to try and attack you. So it just allows you to make play patterns that don't exist without it. And again, you never don't wear Storm Striders. Ironhide Gauntlet, sadly, this is just the best option we have as a generic arm piece. You just want more armor. Again, being able to block efficiently is really important to this deck, and stopping hit triggers can be too when you want to keep cards in your hand. An Ironhide Gauntlet plays very well with activating weapon off of a blue once you've paid for a card from your arsenal, and then being able to use that resource on something meaningful. Sometimes you'll Oasis Respite and have resources left over. You want to use it to tag team up with Oasis Respite to block something that's attacking you for 6. or just stop an important hit trigger. It's a really good card. Sadly, there's nothing really better for you to wear, but it is good, and you should be quite happy with the fact that you at least have this. So sideboard cards, we're going to talk about why these are here, some of the matchups they come in, and the things they are good at doing. So we're going to start on the equipment because it's the easiest place to start. Metacarpus Node. Metacarpus Node is here for the mirror match, for Kano, for Briar, and for Dromai. So for the most part, the mirror match and Kano, fairly self-explanatory. You just want more access to more arcane barrier. Dromai and Briar. So against Dromai, it's important to keep the arcane in check from Asvalai and from Burn Them All, because leaking damage via that arcane can quite easily catch up with you. But more importantly, Mechacarpus Node gives you a way to kill some of the bigger dragons with your damage effects. Cards like Necria or Uvia can be really hard for you to get off the table as Iyslander, because you have to aim damage spells at them and you don't have attacks to send at them instead. And sometimes you just really need to kill Thamai with a blue or something. And having access to Metacarpus Node lets you have a way of jumping those attacks up to a higher damage level, so they can clear a dragon by themselves with just one card as opposed to having to spend two. And Metacarpus Node is your arcane barrier of choice against Briar alongside your shoes, because you want to be able to pop Storm Striders when the time comes, so you can't rely on it for arcane barrier. It costing 2 obviously is never great anyway. But you also really need your Tunic against Briar. You can't afford to give it up, because Tunic paying for Cold Snaps, paying for Oasis Respites, and helping you have better turns because of how often and how aggressively you're blocking. You'll be blocking a lot against Briar to keep your life total high. It's just so important that you can't afford to give it up to play Illuvian Constellus instead. So you need to have an arm piece that has Arcane Barrier on it, and therefore Metacarpus Node fits that role better than anything else. Speaking of Illuvian Constellus, this card is another one of those cards, much like Coronet Peak, that if you intend on playing Wizard at any point in your Flesh and Blood journey, buy one now. They are very cheap for legendaries at the moment, and the card is absurd and will see play for the rest of its time as a Wizard card, as long as it's allowed to do so. This card is single-handedly responsible for the fact that the Viserai matchup is good, because you want to keep life totals even as much as you can all the way down. Illuvian Constellus lets you prevent arcane damage and threaten damage because you prevented damage. Every single time you pay a resource to Illuvian Constellus, you're representing 1.5 points of damage back in return because you prevented it. So you will find yourself often pitching to prevent arcane as opposed to blocking physical against Viserai. Sometimes using your Ironhide Gauntlet to cover up hit triggers, or your Coronet Peak to cover up hit triggers, and prioritizing paying arcane instead to make sure that Constellus is charged, because you want to moon as often, as aggressively as you possibly can in that matchup. And it's just basically there for that matchup and the 2 Wizard mirror matches as additional arcane barrier. You don't win the Iyslander mirror without this card, and unfortunately it is the reason why the Iyslander mirror is kind of miserable and quite often goes to time, just because both of you are pitching blues so aggressively to Constellus, and you basically never deck out as a result. The card is 100% necessary. Definitely pick one up if you can. So, sideboard cards. Eisenhower Weathervane. This is a card that I got a lot of questions about. It doesn't make a lot of sense. People think it's for some of the aggro matchups. Some people think it's for Oldhim. The sad truth is, it is just for Oldhim in my opinion. Although your Insidious Chill amulet effects are very strong against aggro, you only want so much of that effect. And having a red that blocks 2 is so counterproductive to the rest of the already established game plan in these matchups. It doesn't fit any of the roles you want it to, which makes it a bit of a liability against aggro. However, this card does bring your clock forward in the Frost Hex matchups significantly, because it gives you a way of proactively making Frostbites before the kill turn. So you'll find that you quite often pitch these very early to set yourself up with them alongside a way to fuse, a brain freeze, and in case a red damage spell, anything really. And then on the turn before, so you have your Ice Eternal set in your arsenal, all of your OTK pieces set up, your Frost Hexes, your Chills, your Amulets, your Epots, this kind of stuff. And the turn before, you go for the kill with the Ice Eternal in your arsenal, your Tunic on 3, sorry. You'll try and fuse as many Ice Veins as you possibly can, and play a cheap effect that triggers them. So This is why we play Brain Freeze in the Oldhim matchup too, alongside it being a block 3. We'll get to that obviously when we talk about Brain Freeze. But you just need cheap ways to fuse on that turn to make these Ice Veins generate 4 to 8 Frostbites proactively. And then when you go for your Ice Eternal turn, you should just like dunk damage on your opponent when you strip their entire hand away with chills and amulets. Or sometimes you'll find that you actually set up a kill with Freezing Point this way instead off of Stormstriders, because it gains so much additional damage from like 8 extra Frostbites. Without this card, you're relying on getting to the late game, which if Oldhim is ready for you with Heart of Ice, Sledge, sometimes copies of Pummel, maybe even Terra Sunder, trying to go all the way to the end game can actually be somewhat problematic. You're very comfortable up until those final few turns where good Oldhims are actually like threatening your Ice Eternal with Command and Conquer, or sometimes pressuring you with other big attacks, really. Even things like Endless Winter, sometimes Dominated Glacial Footsteps, things like this. Zealous Belting, Go Again turns, Rouse the Ancient, Go Again turns, Enlightened Strike, Go Again turns. These can all be quite dangerous for you in the late game if you try and go to the very, very bottom and set up the full combo. So being able to bring it forward a few turns so that your early chip damage can quite often mean that 25 to 35 damage is enough to kill your opponent on the spot, is worth the slot, in my opinion. It makes that matchup way more comfortable, I think, and lets you just kind of like proactively freeze with Frost Hexes. These are also just really good for early chip damage while you're setting up more Frost Hexes. Obviously, if you only have 1 or 2 in play and you're still looking for the third, sometimes like Weather Vane, fuse a card, make 8 Frostbites is just like a chunk of damage by itself that your opponent can't really play through or do anything productive with their hand a lot of the time. You kind of want to make sure they can't swing Sledge, is the only thing, or they break all those Frostbites for very little gain. But sometimes that can just be like 15 damage by itself, which means that your final combo turn has to do like 15 as well. 15, 20, 25 as well, and that makes it a hell of a lot quicker to get there. Less E-Pots required, less discard effects required, so on and so forth. So hopefully that makes some sense. Fate Foreseen Sig Below. Basically all the aggro matchups. These come in. Even things like Dorinthria. I play them against Briar. I don't play Fate Foreseen against Viscerai. I think I play Sink Below and not Fate Foreseen if I'm recalling my sideboard correctly off the top of my head. Yeah, basically Dash you'll quite often play all 6 just to hedge against them being on Pounder, because if they're on Pounder, you just fatigue them. If they're not, defense reactions are going to let you keep 2 cards in your hand to Coronet, Peak, and Arsenal as often as possible, or activate Weapon and Arsenal as often as possible, which is what you want to be doing if they're not presenting Pounder. So you play them all. These are just kind of indicative to the game plan we've already discussed a lot of the time. Again, your most common game plan, block with 2 cards, pay for a card from Arsenal Weapon, or Coronet Arsenal. Is going to be the play patterns you make the most, and having cards that block 4 means that play pattern is defending for more damage than it would be otherwise, and stopping important hit triggers like Snatch or sometimes like Runic Reclamations when you have Channel Lake Frigids and stuff in play, because it's able to block 2 with 2 cards and stop 7. Fate Foreseen is definitely the worst of the 2. If you're unsure which one to play and you only want 1 set of 3 defense reactions in the matchup, play Sync. It is always much, much better, in my honest opinion. But I do think Fate Foreseen is better than Sigil of Solace, which some people have recommended in this slot, because the 4 block is so relevant when you're trying to defend with 2 cards, and Sigil just doesn't stop hit triggers right now, for which there are so many. As I say, cards like Snatch, even things like Movrian Skies and stuff like this as well. I just think the defense reaction is worth the risk of getting Command and Conquered in a lot of spots. Brain Freeze. This card is really kind of impressive, honestly. This is mostly here for Viscerai, for Briar, for Phi, these aggro matchups that have many, many 0-cost cards. It's solid against Dash, and you're happy to play it there as well. Because they have Spark Geniuses, T-Bones, 0-60s cards that you're happy to put on top with a Fuse. But you also play it into Oldhim, which is something that a lot of people don't necessarily realise. We discussed it earlier that having cheap ways to fuse when you're trying to Weather Vane on those turns is very important. But it's also just a blue block 3 against Oldhim, which makes it better than playing something like Channel Bleak Expanse, just because, again, your card's blocking 3 is overpowered, and you should make it happen as often as you possibly can. Brain Freeze against Viscerai, just crazy good. Taking Rebels, Mordred Tide, Sonatas out of their hands at instant speed is just absolutely backbreaking. Sometimes you can respond to Spellbound Creepers and do disgusting things by taking away the card they intended to Creepers and just turn off their entire turn, blow up Spellbound Creepers. It's just absolutely backbreaking. Not quite as good against Briar, but again, blue block 3 does take away plenty of targets. Gloom Veil, Lightning Surges, Snatches. Just a great card there for disruption as well. And Phi, you'll quite often find that taking away an attack that is going to hit to trigger Massive Momentum, or sometimes when they rebuy their Phoenix Flame, you can put the Phoenix Flame back on top of their deck as well. So they have to draw it again is really powerful and something you should definitely be paying attention to. Blue Arctic Incarceration. This is not a card that you play in too many matchups. Again, blocking 2, really big downside for the most part. This was actually a last minute change I made. I cut some edges, basically the amulet, the third amulet, the third scour, and the third blizzard just before the event to fit 3 of these back in. And I did that to improve the Guardian matchups. Arctic Incarceration is one of your better pieces of disruption once Frost Hexes are established, because it makes 2 Frostbites by itself from the arsenal at 0 cost. Which, when you're trying to tag team this alongside a freezing point, can often mean that your freezing point is doing 8 damage off of just Arctic Incarceration and the freezing point from your Storm Striders. Because they have a Frost Hex in play, of course. Excuse me. So you want it in those matchups more than you want it anywhere else. If you're ever unsure of what you're supposed to be bringing in, this is kind of fine. But for the most part, this is for the more controlling matchups than it is the aggro ones. You don't want it against Briar, Phi, Viscerai. 2 Frostbites often just not enough to impact their turn in a significant way, and blocking 2 is just a liability, so you have to keep that in mind. 2 Energy Potions. These are, again, mostly for Frost Hex matchups. You want to be playing these against your Guardians to give you additional resources to turbocharge those Ice Eternals, or maybe squeaking a weapon activation in a spot where you wouldn't normally be able to get one because you were short of resources. I do, however, play these into Dash as well. It sounds kind of weird because they don't block and they can be a bit of a liability against Dash, but I found that Dash really wants to pitch its blues early, so that the late game turns against you, their hand is 4 blues, because then they can pay to prevent everything and still push damage with pistol. And as a result, you really want to be able to block those turns out in the late game very aggressively. And so having access to Energy Potion in those spots, having set them up early, is going to let you still play a turn while blocking with sometimes 4 cards. Or squeaking a weapon activation when you're trying to keep life totals even if they allow you to be able to do that. To try and go for a Storm Strider's kill. So it's not ideal. I don't think Energy Potion is here for the Dash matchup or anything. I just think it's better than playing Blizzard in that matchup because they have so many blues. Which is genuinely an off-putting point to playing Blizzard. So if you think an Energy Potion is crap, you can play Blizzard instead. But I just think it's kind of better than playing Blizzard. 2 Scour. Wow, this card is good. I would like to explore finding space for a 3rd after the weekend at some point, but I think 2 might just be the perfect number. This is mostly here for Viscerai. It's gonna do some disgusting things from your arsenal in blowing up Revel in Runeblood, Rune Chants, or just a big Mordred Tide turn, clearing all those Rune Chants, and being a 12-point, 15-point life swing in the damage that it prevents and then does to your opponent. It's just something that no other card can do, which is completely insane. It's a blue block 3 for some reason. It just blocks 3 as well while being a damage spell. But this card has some other applications too. I was playing it against Prism because it clears up all the Spectral Shields, all the blue auras, which was a way for us to take them off the table, which we obviously can't do otherwise. And I have occasionally played this against Bravo, but I think that is wrong. There have been spots where popping Seismic Surges to make your Frostbites feel more relevant seems appealing. but I seem to find that as Bravo players get more used to playing against Iyslander, they stop making seismic searches. Because they want to just be able to volley damage at you and threaten pummel, or not give you a window to respond with a card from your arsenal before there's just like an attack for 8 or 10 or 11 or something on the combat chain. So they stop making surges a lot of the time, and outside of heave turns, it doesn't really do enough for you, so I don't play it there anymore. A few people have kind of mentioned playing this into Briar for the Embodiment of Earths and Embodiment of Lightnings. I think it's just too narrow a lot of the time. Arsenaling this card and having to spend 2 resources to like clear Earth, clear Lightning, or 1 resource, and then weaponing, is like, it seems just pretty mediocre compared to the other things you can do in this matchup. You would much rather just slow the Briar player down and work towards that kind of established end game, as opposed to like trying to punk an Embodiment of Lightning in a spot where they give you priority, which is just pretty hard to do. So wouldn't recommend in the Briar matchup, if I'm being completely honest. Channel the Bleak Expanse. This card is crazy good. A block 2 has to be very good to make the cut in this deck, just because of how detrimental it is for cards to block 2. But this card turns off so many power plays against so many of the big decks right now. Viserai can't Sonata, it can't become the Arc Knight, it can't, draw cards in any way. These are big impactful cards that Viserai relies on to do its big combo turns. Briar, it turns off Bramble Spark, turns off Tome of Harvest, turns off Snatch. These are all cards you're also very, very scared of. If you Bleak Expanse in response to a Tome of Harvest, the game just ends. Your opponent spent 3 on a card, lost their arsenal and drew nothing, and they got a Frostbite for their trouble. It's just like absolutely backbreaking immediately, in my opinion. Against Phi, this just stops Belittle, it stops Mask of Momentum, and these are just, like, again, cards you should be scared of. It stops Art of War. They can't draw, they like banish and draw 2 from an Art of War if there is a Bleak Expanse in play, and again, like, responding to Art of War could sometimes mean they just wasted their Art of War turn, which is all you can ever ask for in that matchup, and they got a Frostbite in the process. This card is like so flexible in so many of those matchups. The only thing you do have to be aware of, do be aware that it will stop you fusing as well. You also can't draw cards or reveal cards while this is on the table, so you can't Ice Vein, you can't trigger your chills, you can't do any of this. And you need to know that if you're choosing to keep it around by pitching to Coronet, or something like, or pitching to Weapon, or anything like that. Keep it in mind so that you don't accidentally like want to trigger chill in your opponent's turn with a blue Aether Ice Vein and not be able to fuse. So worth keeping in mind. 2 Blizzard. I find this card to be worse in aggro matchups than Hypothermia. That's the reason why it's the 2 of and not Hypothermia. It obviously doesn't block at all. At least Hypothermia blocks 2, which does make it slightly better. And I find that Hypothermia is better on resolution against things like Prism or Viserai after Movrian Skies, once their Spellbound Creepers has been popped, or sometimes even when their Creepers hasn't been popped. Blizzard finds itself like kind of at ends with the fact that so many of the aggro decks right now just have such a large amount of blues. Briar has like 15 because it's playing Channel Mount Heroic. Viserai can sometimes have like 23 blues, which is crazy for a deck that's aggressive. And also just kind of has access to Spellbound Creepers already. Blizzard, like even Dash is like 20, 23, 24 blues or something like that, because there's so many reasonable ones there. Like, Blizzard suffers in these spots. Like, while it does make a Frostbite for you, your opponent can pay more than you would think, which makes Blizzard, I think, a little unimpressive against the room right now in the matchups where you would think you want this effect. That being said, it is still very good in spots when you can pick it alongside an Arsenal card. If you can play a card from your Arsenal, make a Frostbite, Blizzard from your hand, and make another Frostbite, you can quite often shut turns down that way. Or, worst comes to worst, this ends up being the card that doesn't block in your hand, you pitch it to Coronet, Arsenal, something else. And save it for later. But it is definitely the weaker of the 2, I think, and that's why I'm playing 2 copies, but it's still good enough to be played in those matchups. Hypothermia. This card is super impressive, honestly. Most importantly, 0-cost blue ice card means it can be played from the arsenal for free to get cheap weapon activations and leave you with a resource to pay for Oasis Respite or something similar. And it's just great at shutting down turns immediately. You find this is worse than Blizzard quite often against Fi, unfortunately. A lot of their attacks already have Go Again, but the upcoming versions of Fi that have been playing Kodachis get folded in half by Hypothermia. Hypothermia much better against Briar because they rely so much on the embodiment of lightning in order to get Go Again. But admittedly now a little bit worse if the Matthew Falk's version of Briar that's playing Spellbound Creepers is the version to play going forward, as Creepers kind of lets you circumvent this in a pinch if you need to. Something that the Briar list I've been testing against prior to Lille couldn't really do because they were still just playing Snapdragon Scalers. I do think it is one of your better cards against aggro. It's worth playing this block too to just often just turn off cards. It's also just good against Dromai because you can just play it after a dragon attacks that isn't Chromai and stop the turn if you didn't get the ability to pop the dragon to take away the action point. So definitely worth playing there as well. A lot of spots where this is just solid. And then last but not least, Fiendl's Fighting Spirit. This was obviously mostly for Illusionist between Dromai and Prism. But it is the best popper this deck can play by a lot. It's yellow, so it pitches to weapon in a pinch. And the gain life trigger comes up all the time because you're a lot lower than your opponent nearly always because of your starting health though. And you'll find that it still triggers on Spectra and on killing dragons and stuff. So you get to gain a life while doing it, or popping Phantasm. Still gain a life while doing it, which makes it just the best popper this deck can play by a lot. I've had a lot of people ask what I'm going to do about this slot now that Prism is LL'd. And the truth is at the moment I think it stays. This card really helps against Dromai and gives you a fighting chance there. It's very easy for you to bounce damage off of dragons to take away action points and activate weapon, which they struggle to pay for if they can't use their furnace. And popping in spots that matter and gaining a little bit of life in the process is very good in that matchup. And having a 6 power attack to be able to send at Uvia or Thamai or something, it seems really impactful in that matchup too. So I think having my 15 to 20% against Dromai is worth more than I think any card I could think of right now is going to improve any other matchup. But that might change as the format evolves and reacts to Lille, and maybe if Dromai just isn't very popular whatsoever. I think if I wanted to use this slot for something else and just abandon the Illusion matchup entirely, I would be trying to find something that I want to play that makes the Bravo matchup better. But that isn't unmovable, unfortunately, because you really can't afford to have that sitting in your arsenal. Because you need access to your arsenal every turn. So I'm not really sure what that would be at the moment, honestly. But if you're looking to change this slot for something now that Prism is gone, it probably should be a card that is good against Bravo. And that's kind of where I am on that at the moment. So last but not least, this video has actually gone on quite long. But I'm going to talk about a brief tip or trick that is worth knowing in this deck when you're playing it moving forward if you want to be doing exactly that sometimes aren't intuitive. I'm not going to look into things too much that are very obvious, but just little things that maybe you don't know or aren't aware of that come up quite a lot. So the two that immediately come to mind for me is that you can often be the best Channel Lake Frigid deck in the game, because keeping it around is very easy thanks to Coronet Peak and your weapon. It's very easy for you to pitch 2 cards on demand. To keep this around for 3 turns total, which is obviously completely insane. Don't be scared to leave yourself without an arsenal. Sometimes preventing damage is worth it. Sometimes keeping Channel Lake Frigid around for another turn, thanks to pitching to Coronet Peak, is worth it. You are not you obviously want to have an arsenal every turn if possible, but you're not dead in the water if you don't have it. So think about the value of arsenaling the card that you get to keep before you just assume that you have to arsenal a card every turn. Most of the time you're going to want to keep that card to arsenal, but not always, and a lot of games are going to live and die on the fact that you did. Secondly, there's a really weird interaction with Frostbites that you need to know when you're playing this deck because it comes up a bit more than it should. If your opponent pays for something to break Frostbites, technically speaking, those Frostbites aren't broken yet. They are a trigger. They go onto the combat chain to resolve being paid for. Which means for now, they're still in play. So you can respond to your opponent playing something and breaking Frostbites with something that cares about Frostbites, like Freezing Point, for example, and those Frostbites still count towards the total of things that Freezing Point sees or these other effects see. But more importantly, if your opponent wants to respond to you doing that, they have to pay for the Frostbite again. And this seems like it should never come up, but it really does more than you'd think. So, if they were like paying for something to break Frostbites and you respond, they're going to have to pay 2 for their Crown of Siege still, because the Frostbite is still there, or 3 or 4 for their Crown of Siege still if it's like multiple Frostbites. And that really matters when Crown of Siege is going to be the thing that prevents like another point of Arcane, or activating Prism's hero ability maybe would be the thing that prevents another point of Arcane, and instead of costing 2, it still currently costs like 4 or 5. Or even 3 sometimes against Prism is like super relevant. So knowing that Frostbites are a trigger that you can respond to, and they still count as being there until the effect that is breaking them resolves, comes up like way more than it should. And it's definitely something you want to be aware of. Things that come off the top of my head other than that, we've talked about like playing Tunic and Cold Snap as much as you can. Metacarpus Node killing dragons against Dromite. Brain Freeze. Is there anything else I haven't mentioned about Brain? No, I think most things I've said about Brain Freeze has been covered. I suppose the last thing I'll mention is that Insidious Chill is mandatory. Do not forget that this card is a must trigger effect. So in a lot of matchups like Oldhim or Bravo, where you want to set up these combo turns, sometimes playing your Ice Veins or your Incases or even like other fuse effects and not fusing and not getting the fuse ability is correct, just so that you don't waste those chill triggers if you don't want to. So think very carefully about whether or not you want chill to trigger right now. It's not optional. But for the most part, you just need to have one trigger left for those turns on your chills, not all 3. So it's not the end of the world if you're triggering them early, if you have to. Beyond that, I think that is just about everything that I can think of off the top of my head right now. If you have questions about what you're supposed to be boarding in certain matchups, I'm more than happy to answer them on social media or in the comments section. I think for the most part, once you know all the cards on the right hand side are the sideboard choices, your 17 cards are fairly intuitive in most matchups based on what we've discussed. But if at any point you aren't sure and you want to know, just hit me up and I'll do my best to let you know as soon as possible. So thank you for checking this out. I know it's a super long video. Hopefully the detail is beneficial to people that are looking to pick up Iyslander and get ready to play this deck in a competitive sense. Once again, you can find me at HowlingMines on the internet everywhere. Feel free to reach out and come check out my content. I would really appreciate that at some point. And hopefully I'll see you at a Calling or a Nationals or a Pro Tour sometime very, very soon. So thanks for checking this out, guys. Enjoy Iyslander in Classic Constructed. And hopefully I shall see you very soon. Take care. Have a good one.